The waterfall had no name, not because it was too small to deserve one and not because no one had ever seen it. The families who lived nearest to it, scattered along the hollows of the Cumberland Plateau in eastern Tennessee, had seen it plenty. They had passed it on deer trails. They had heard it from ridgelines. They had watched it freeze into a wall of white glass in January and swell into a roaring curtain in March. But they did not name it because on the Cumberland Plateau in the 1880s, water falling over rock was not a remarkable thing. It was just the land doing what the land does. You did not name every creek, you did not name every ridge, and you did not name a waterfall that was only 15 feet wide and 20 feet tall, pouring over a limestone ledge into a pool that drained into a creek that fed into the Sequatchie River 2 miles south. In spring, when the snowmelt came down from the plateau, the falls ran heavy and white and loud enough to drown a voice at 20 paces. In late summer, the flow thinned to a veil, a sheet of water no thicker than a man's hand, translucent, the rock face behind it visible through the moving glass like a shadow behind a curtain. Behind the curtain was the ledge, a shelf of limestone 8 feet deep and 14 feet wide, recessed into the cliff face carved by 10,000 years of water eating at a softer layer of stone sandwiched between two harder layers. The floor was flat dry, despite the waterfall 3 feet in front of it, because the water fell straight down from the lip above, and the ledge was recessed far enough that only wind-driven spray reached the back wall. The ceiling was the overhanging lip of the upper limestone layer, 7 feet above the floor, at the front sloping to 5 at the back. Solid rock, uncracked, bearing the weight of the hillside above it the way it had borne it for millennia. The back wall was rough limestone, pocked and uneven, but solid dry to the touch. Cool in summer, warm in winter relative to the outside air, because it was backed by hundreds of feet of rock that maintained a constant temperature regardless of what the sky was doing. No one knew about the ledge. No one had reason to look behind a waterfall that no one had bothered to name. And then on a January afternoon in 1884, a man named Josiah Kane found smoke coming out of it. Josiah was 60 years old. He was lean, the way a fence rail is lean not from hunger, but from decades of walking and bending and carrying, and the leanness had settled into his frame the way weather settles into wood, permanent structural part of the grain. His beard was white-stained yellow at the corners of his mouth from 50 years of tobacco. His eyes were blue, and they had been looking at the forest floor for so long that they noticed everything that was not a root and most things that were. He dug ginseng. That was his living and had been his living for 40 years. He walked the slopes and creek beds of the Cumberland Plateau with the slow, deliberate gait of a man who understood that the forest revealed its secrets to the patient and hid them from the hurried. He sold the roots to a buyer in Pikeville who shipped them east. He spoke to the buyer. He spoke to the storekeeper. He spoke to almost no one else and had not for 13 years because 13 years ago, the only person he had ever truly spoken to had died, and after that, speaking seemed like a thing that belonged to a different man in a different life. He found the waterfall by following a hollow down toward the creek. He heard at first the sound like applause in an empty room, like wind in wet oak leaves, something between music and machinery. Then he saw the water thin in the January cold, falling over the ledge into the dark pool. And then he saw the smoke. Not chimney smoke. There was no chimney, no house, no cabin, no structure visible anywhere in the hollow. Just smoke rising from the rock face behind the waterfall, seeping from a crack in the limestone cliff as though the mountain itself were breathing. Josiah was not a man who surprised easily. He had lived 60 years on this plateau. He knew every kind of smoke: leaf mold steaming after rain when the sun hit it, peat smoke from the bays in the bottomland, fog rising from bat caves on cold mornings. But smoke from inside stone behind a waterfall in January he had never seen. He climbed the rocks beside the falls, slowly, carefully, the way a man climbs who knows that 60-year-old bones do not heal fast, and that the rocks are wet and mossy, and that one bad step means lying at the bottom of a hollow where no one will find you until spring. He reached the top of the rock fall beside the curtain, and he stepped through the edge of the falling water. It hit his left shoulder and arm cold enough to make his teeth clench. And he saw her, a young woman, small, sitting beside a fire on a limestone ledge, sewing a tear in her dress. By firelight, the waterfall falling 3 feet in front of her like a curtain drawn across the stage. The room behind the waterfall, and it was a room, not a cave, not a hole, a room, was warm, noticeably, surprisingly warm. and dry, and furnished with the spare efficiency of a place where every object had been earned and every surface had been considered. A stone hearth against the back wall, a sleeping platform of flat stones covered with hemlock boughs and a wool blanket, a cooking area with a flat stone griddle and a tin pot, a storage shelf of stacked flat stones along the south wall, a doorway gap of 2 feet at the south end of a dry stack wall that ran the full width of the ledge, 3 feet high, 2 feet thick, positioned 2 feet back from the edge to leave a gap between the wall and the waterfall where the mist could fall and drain without reaching the interior. Josiah stood in the doorway gap and said nothing. He said nothing for a long time because he was a man who had spent 60 years learning that the first thing you say about a thing you do not understand is usually wrong. And because what he was looking at was a thing he did not understand. A woman young enough to be his daughter living behind a waterfall in a room she had built with her own hands out of stone and fire and silence in the dead of winter alone. "How long?" he finally asked. "Since October," the woman said. "You warm enough?" The woman put her hand flat against the back wall, the limestone surface. She held it there the way you hold your hand against something you trust. "Feel," she said. Josiah stepped into the room. It was the first time in 13 years he had stepped through the doorway of another person's home, though he did not realize this at the time. He walked to the back wall and pressed his palm to the stone. The rock was warm, not fire warm, not stove warm, body warm. The warmth of a living surface as though the cliff itself had a pulse. He held his hand there for a long time, longer than was normal, because the warmth reminded him of something he had forgotten or had tried to forget, and he needed time to bear the remembering. "The mountain's warming you," he said. "I'm warming the mountain," the woman said. "It's warming me back." Her name was Celia Graves. She was 21 years old. And to understand how she came to be sitting behind a waterfall sewing a dress by firelight in January, you have to go back to September, to a tulip poplar, to a sound that was not a scream. Silas Graves was 24, tall, quiet, the kind of man whose hands had been calloused since he was 14 and whose silence was not emptiness, but economy. The silence of a man who only spoke when he had something that needed saying and who trusted that the people around him could tell the difference between nothing to say and too much to say. He was the youngest of 6 brothers raised in a hollow on the same plateau, and he had married Celia in the spring of 1882 after a courtship that lasted 4 months and consisted almost entirely of him buying things he did not need from the general store in Pikeville where she worked. The first time he came in for rope, she handed him the wrong kind. He looked at the coil, looked at her, and bought it anyway. The next week he came back for more rope, the right kind this time, but he also bought the wrong kind again. Celia understood by the 3rd week when he came in and bought nothing at all, just stood at the counter until she asked, "What do you need today?" And he said, "I haven't decided yet, I'm thinking." They married that spring. They claimed 40 acres at the head of a hollow 3 miles north of the waterfall that neither of them knew existed. They built a 1-room cabin, dirt floor, oak, shingle roof, and began clearing land. Silas felled trees, Celia burned stumps. They planted corn on the new ground and kept 1 cow and 2 chickens. The life was poor, but it had direction. They talked about next season, about the fence line Silas wanted to run along the east side, about the child they would have. Silas had already started carving a cradle from cherry wood. Celia saw it every evening by the fire half finished, smelling of fresh wood, and it was proof that the future existed. They had a habit. Every night before sleep, Silas would place his hand on Celia's forehead. He did not say anything. He just held it there for a few seconds, then took it away. She never asked why. She only knew that it was the way he said the thing he did not have words for, and she did not need the words because the hand was enough. On the 2nd day of September in 1883, Silas was clearing a new field at the edge of the hollow. The tulip poplar was 4 feet at the base, dead at the crown, but green at the trunk. The kind of tree that experienced woodsmen feared most because it was heavy, because it did not fall the way you wanted it to, and because it waited until you cut the wrong notch, and then it taught you what gravity means. Silas cut the wrong notch. Not because he was careless. He had felled hundreds of trees. But the base was rotted inside where he could not see, and the trunk twisted as it fell, and 4 feet of diameter came down 15 degrees off the line he had planned, and it caught him across the chest and pinned him to the red clay. Celia was at the cabin 50 yards away heating water for washing. She heard the crack. Then she heard the sound that came after the crack, which was not a scream, but something worse. A single word, her name, spoken at a volume that meant he knew, not shouted, not yelled, spoken the way you speak when the air in your lungs is being pressed out by something that weighs more than the world, and you have enough breath for one word, and you choose the word that matters most, and you say it at the volume of absolute certainty because there will not be a second word, and you know that, and you want the one word to carry. She ran. She found him. The trunk lay across his chest, pressing him into the earth, and he was still breathing, but each breath was shorter than the one before. Each inhale a little shallower, each exhale a little longer, and the sound of it was the sound of something closing. A door closes slowly on a spring hinge, not slamming, but swinging shut, with a patience that makes the closing worse than any slam. She tried to lift the tree. It did not move, not a fraction of an inch. 4 feet of tulip poplar, the wood dense and heavy, even dead, the trunk wedged into the soft earth by the force of its own fall. She ran for the axe. She tried to chop the branches to reduce the weight. The blade bounced because she was chopping at the wrong angle, and her hand bled, and Silas said, his voice quiet now, the quietness of a man conserving what little air he had left. Don't, sit down. She sat down beside him. 2 hours. He did not scream. He did not cry. He talked to her about the fence. The fence he was going to build on the east side, what kind of wood to use, how to dig the post holes straight so they would hold through frost heave, how deep to set them so the bottom rail would clear the snow line. He talked as though he would still be here next week to build it. And Celia understood, sitting in the red clay beside the man she had married 16 months ago, holding his hand while the light changed from midday white to afternoon gold, that this was how he loved her the last time. By pretending that the future still existed. By talking about fence posts while his lungs collapsed. By giving her something ordinary to hold on to while the extraordinary thing happened, the way you give a child a toy to hold while you carry them through a storm. The moment Silas stopped breathing was not a dramatic thing. There was no final gasp, no last word, no Hollywood moment where the dying man says something beautiful and the music swells and the camera pulls back. The moment was this: his hand was holding hers, and she felt the exact instant when the force of the grip did not release but dissolved, like water soaking into dry ground. 1 second his hand was holding, the next second his hand was resting. And the difference between holding and resting was the difference between alive and everything after. She sat beside him until the light was gone. Then she stood and walked to the cabin and sat on the floor. Not the bed, because the bed had the smell of him, and the smell was both the only thing left and the thing that would kill her if she breathed it. And she sat on the dirt floor in the dark cabin, and she did not sleep, and she did not cry, and she did not die, though she considered all three with equal attention. She sold the 40 acres for $12 to the neighbor who had wanted them since the day Silas staked the claim. She paid the burying costs, $3 for the pine box, $2 for the preacher who said words that Celia heard but did not listen to because the words were about a man the preacher did not know, spoken over a box that contained a man the preacher had never met, and the gap between the words and the man was so wide that the words fell into it and disappeared. She packed a canvas sack with a dress, a shawl, a tin cup, a knife, and the $7 that remained. On the 21st day after Silas died, she walked out the cabin door for the last time. She looked at the stump of the tulip poplar, the only thing left after the neighbors came with mules and chains to drag the trunk away. The stump sat in this clearing like an open eye in the face of the earth. It was the first thing she saw when she opened the cabin door in the morning, and it would be the first thing she thought every morning for the rest of her life if she stayed. The stump and the memory of the sound, the crack and then the word. She did not stay. She walked south. She did not lock the door because the door had no lock. She did not look back because looking back is the act of someone who has a reason to return, and she did not have one. She walked for 2 days along the ridge trails of the Cumberland Plateau. She slept in the open, wrapped in her shawl on the ground, on the leaves under skies that were clear and cold, and full of stars that she did not look at because beauty was a thing that required a capacity she no longer had. She did not eat because she had not thought to bring food, and because hunger was a feeling she could understand, and therefore did not fear the way she feared the other feelings, the ones that had no names and no edges and no bottom. She did not intend to walk far. She intended to walk until the walking stopped, until the ground ended, or the strength ended, or the reason to keep walking ended, and whatever came first would decide what happened next. She was not choosing death. She was not choosing life. She was choosing nothing, which is what you choose when the machinery of choosing has broken, and the only thing left is motion one foot and then the other, the body carrying itself forward, because that is what bodies do, the way a river flows downhill. Not because it wants to, but because gravity exists and water cannot argue with gravity. Her mother had died when Celia was 11, lung fever in the winter of 1873. Before the dying in the last week when the fever was high and the breathing was wet and the cabin smelled of camphor and wood smoke and the particular sweetness that comes from a body burning its last reserves, her mother had said something that Celia did not understand. She said, "Stone doesn't die, Celia. Stone just waits." Celia was 11. She did not know what it meant. Walking on the Ridge Trail 10 years later, she still did not know. But the words were in her the way a seed is in the ground before the rain comes. Not growing, not dead, just waiting. On the second afternoon, she heard the waterfall before she saw it. A sound like applause, like wind in heavy leaves, like something between music and machinery. She followed the sound down a steep slope through a forest of hemlock and rhododendron, the undergrowth so thick that she had to push through it sideways, branches scratching her face and arm, her dress catching on the rhododendron's woody stems, and she came out on the rocks beside the pool at the base of the falls and looked up at the curtain of water and saw through the thinning October flow the shadow of the ledge behind it. She climbed the rocks beside the falls, wet, mossy, treacherous. She slipped once and caught herself on a rhododendron root and climbed again. She reached the edge of the curtain and stepped through. The water hit her shoulder and arm and soaked the left side of her dress. Cold, October cold. The cold of water that has traveled through stone and carries the stone's temperature with it. And she stood on the dry limestone shelf behind the waterfall and looked out through the falling water at the green world beyond and felt something shift in her chest that was not grief and was not hope, but was the space between them where decisions are made. She sat on the limestone floor with her back against the back wall, and she listened to the waterfall, and she did not die. She sat for 3 hours watching the light change on the falling water. Gold in the late afternoon, silver as the sun dropped, gray as the dusk came, and she did not die. And when the dark came and the waterfall was nothing but a sound in the blackness, she pulled her shawl over her shoulders and lay on the stone and closed her eyes. And she did not die. And in the morning when the light came through the water, like light through a cathedral window, green and gold and broken into moving patterns on the stone ceiling, she opened her eyes and understood that the decision had been made and that the decision was to stay. She built the wall in 6 days. Dry stacked limestone flat stones, gathered from the slope above and from the rockfall at the base of the cliff, carried one by one each stone, 10 to 30 pounds, 40 or 50 stones a day, from first light to last light, 3 feet high, 2 feet thick, running the full 14 feet of the ledge width, set 2 feet back from the edge to leave a gap between the wall and the waterfall. A 2-foot gap at the south end for a doorway, accessible by climbing the rocks beside the falls and stepping through the thin edge of the curtain where the spray was lightest. The work had a geography. The slope above the ledge was scattered with loose limestone pieces that had broken from the cliff face over centuries and tumbled into the leaf litter and the rhododendron roots. Some were the right shape, flat and broad, the kind of stone that stacks. Others were wrong-rounded or wedge-shaped or too heavy to lift. Celia learned to read the stones the way a root digger reads the forest floor, by looking until the looking became seeing and the seeing became knowing. She could glance at a scatter of rock on a hillside and pick out the 3 stones that would fit the gap she was trying to fill, the way a carpenter can glance at a stack of lumber and pick out the board he needs. She carried them down the slope to the ledge one at a time, the weight in her arms, the path growing more defined with each trip, her feet wearing a trail through the leaf mold that became a line in the hillside, a mark that said, someone is working here. Someone is going back and forth between the scattered and the structured, between the raw material and the finished thing, and the distance between those two places is measured in trips, and the trips are measured in will. Her hands blistered on the second day and calloused by the fourth. Her back ached in the place where the spine meets the hips, the place that bears the weight of every stone you lift and every stone you carry, and every stone you set down wrong and have to pick up again. Her shoulders burned, her fingernails cracked. She cut her palm on a sharp edge on the third day and wrapped it in a strip torn from her hem and kept working because the blood dried and the skin closed and the wall was not finished and the wall needed finishing because the wall was the difference between a ledge and a room, between a place and a home, between waiting to die and deciding to live, though she did not think of it in those terms yet. She thought only of the next stone and the next and the next. But she did not stop. Stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering, and remembering meant hearing Silas say her name at the volume of certainty. So she kept the rhythm. Lift, carry, place, fit. The rhythm of stonework matched the beating of a heart that had not yet decided whether to continue. And as long as the rhythm held, the heart held, and as long as the heart held, the wall grew. And the wall was proof that something inside her was choosing, even though she did not yet know what it was choosing or why. When the wall was finished, she stood behind it for the first time and felt the difference. The space behind the wall was warmer, drier, stiller. The temperature of the back wall, 52 degrees year-round, courtesy of the hundreds of feet of thermal mass behind it, was held in the enclosed space instead of being swept away by cold air from the falls. The mist fell on the outer side of the wall and drained off the ledge. The cold air currents created by the falling water hit the wall and stopped. She placed her hand flat against the back wall, the limestone, cool, dry, certain. And she remembered her mother's words. Stone doesn't die, Celia. Stone just waits. Standing behind the wall she had built with her own hands, her palm on the rock face, listening to the waterfall sing its endless song, 3 feet away, she thought that maybe for the first time she understood. Now back to that January afternoon. Josiah Kane, his palm on the warm limestone wall, standing in a room that a 21-year-old widow had built from nothing, feeling heat radiating from rock that she had taught to hold warmth the way a lake holds rain. He looked at her. She was small, 5'3", brown hair, pulled back from a face that was thinner than it had been in October, but that had lost the hollowness of a person who is not eating and replaced it with the leanness of a person who works hard and eats enough. Dark blue eyes that had seen something terrible and had looked away from it and then looked back and decided to keep looking. And Josiah thought in the silence of his own skull, where no one would ever hear it. She is 21 years old and she is warming the mountain. I am 60 years old and I am letting the mountain go cold. He did not mean it literally. He still lit a fire in his cabin every night. But the other kind of fire, the kind you light because you want to live and not just because you are afraid of the cold, that fire he had let go out the day Martha lay down and did not get up. Martha Kane, dead in the winter of 1871. Lung sickness, 44 years old. They had married when they were both 22 and lived 25 years on the same hillside, in the same cabin, the cabin Josiah had built with his own hands, from white oak logs he had felled and notched and stacked and chinked with mud from the creek, the cabin where Caleb was born and Martha died. And the 25 years between those two events contained everything Josiah Kane had ever wanted and everything he had ever lost. Martha was the only person Josiah had ever truly talked to. Not the talking you do to buy and sell and comment on the weather and agree that the winter is cold and the summer is hot. The other kind, the kind where you do not have to explain why you are saying what you are saying because the person listening already knows before you open your mouth. The kind where silence is not empty but full, not absence but presence, not the gap between words but a word itself, the most important word, the word that means I do not need to speak because you already hear me. When Martha died, Josiah did not collapse. He did not weep where anyone could see. He buried her on the hillside behind the cabin under the oak tree where she liked to sit on summer evenings, watching the light change on the ridgeline. The light going from gold to rose to purple to dark, the same progression every evening, the same beauty, and Martha watching it every evening as though she had never seen it before, which was Josiah understood only after she was gone, the mark of a person who was truly alive, the ability to see a thing you have seen 1,000 times and still find it worth watching. He carved the letter M into the bark of the oak. Then he went inside. He sat at the table. He looked at the empty chair across from him, the oak rocking chair he had made for Martha in the second year of their marriage, and he began to freeze. He did not call it freezing. He called it continuing. He continued to dig ginseng, continued to sell in Pikeville, continued to eat and sleep and chop wood and patch the roof. But every action had the quality of a thing done by muscle and not by intention. like a clock still running after the person who wound it has left the room. The mechanism worked. The hands moved. The hours passed. But the purpose, the reason the clock was built, the desire to know what time it is, and therefore to know that time matters, and therefore to know that the future matters, that was gone. The clock ran. The clock did not know why. 13 years of that, breathing without living, moving without going anywhere. And then there was Caleb, his son, born in 1860, raised on the hillside, taught to dig ginseng by watching and following the way Josiah had been taught by his own father, the knowledge passing from hand to hand across the generations like a tool that never wears out, because each person who holds it sharpens it before passing it on. Caleb fished the creek, shot squirrels with the old flintlock that had been his grandfather's. Caleb was like Martha. He talked easily, laughed easily, wanted to see what was beyond the hillside, beyond the hollow, beyond the ridgeline where the light went to die every evening. In 1876, 5 years after Martha died, Caleb was 16. He stood in the cabin doorway one morning in October, his pack on his back, his boots laced, and he said, "Pa, I'm going west." Josiah was sitting at the table. He looked at his son. He did not speak. Caleb waited. The silence between them was not the good kind, not the full kind. It was the empty kind. The kind where a father should be saying, "Don't go," or "Go well," or "I love you," or any of the thousand things a father says to a son who is leaving, and instead says nothing because the machinery of saying has been broken for 5 years, and he does not know how to fix it and does not know that it needs fixing because he has been calling the brokenness continuing and continuing sounds like it is enough. Caleb waited for as long as a 16-year-old boy can wait for his father to speak, which is not very long because 16-year-old boys believe that the world is waiting for them and that waiting is a thing you do only when there is nothing better to do. He waited. The silence stretched, and the silence became the answer. Caleb left. No letters followed. No word. 8 years of absence, which is its own kind of presence, the presence of the missing, which takes up more space in a room than any person sitting in a chair. Josiah never spoke about Caleb, but he kept the boy's old flintlock hung on the cabin wall, and once a year on the day Caleb left, he took it down and cleaned it, oiled the barrel, wiped the stock, checked the flint, not because he expected Caleb to come back and need it, not because the gun needed cleaning, which it did not because a gun that is never fired needs no maintenance, but because the act of cleaning it was the only act he allowed himself that acknowledged the boy existed, that the absence was real, that something was gone and the space it left was not. Nothing but something heavy and specific and shaped exactly like a sun. He left the Waterfall room that January afternoon. He walked back to his cabin. He sat at the table. He looked at Martha's chair, the empty one, and for the first time in 13 years, he saw it as truly empty. Not empty in the way he had grown so accustomed to that he no longer noticed like a sound you have heard so long, it becomes silence. But empty in the way you notice when you have just been in a room that was full of fire and warmth, and the presence of a person who was actually living, not just continuing, and whose living made the walls warm and the air warm and the stone itself warm, with the heat of a life being chosen rather than endured. 3 days later, he packed a sack of cornmeal and walked to the waterfall. He did not explain the cornmeal. He set it on the stone shelf beside Celia's panniers. He sat down. He drank a cup of water from the falls. He sat for 20 minutes without speaking. Then he left. Celia did not ask why he came. She understood silence. She had lived with it for 3 months. She knew there were two kinds. The kind that is empty because there is nothing to say, and the kind that is full because there is too much that cannot be said. Josiah's silence was the second kind. She recognized it the way you recognize a face you have seen in a mirror. It looked like hers. And his visits became the only calendar she kept. The weeks measured not by days, but by the sound of his boots on the wet rocks beside the curtain. And though neither of them said it, and neither of them would something had begun. Not a friendship exactly. Not yet. Something quieter. Something that lived in the space between a sack of cornmeal set on a stone shelf and a cup of water offered without being asked for. Something that had no name because the people who felt it did not consider it remarkable enough to name the same way you do not name a waterfall that has always been there falling, waiting, doing what it does. Winter on the Cumberland Plateau does not arrive. It descends. It comes down from the ridgelines like something with weight pressing the temperature into the hollows, pushing the cold air into every crack and crevice and gap in every cabin wall and every stone shelter and every place where a human being has decided to stay through the months when the land itself seems to be asking why. Josiah Cain had survived 60 winters on this plateau. He knew what cold could do. He had seen it kill cattle standing up frozen in place in fields where they had stopped walking and never started again. He had seen it kill men who fell asleep drunk on ridge trails and were found in March with their hands still in their pockets, their faces peaceful with the particular piece of people who stopped feeling the cold before they stopped feeling anything. Cold on the Cumberland did not kill you fast. It killed you the way debt kills you, by taking a little more than you could afford every night, compounding, accumulating, until one morning the balance was zero and you did not wake up. He thought about this every Thursday as he walked the 3 miles from his cabin to the waterfall through November and into December. He thought about the woman behind the falls alone with a wool blanket and a stone wall and a fire that needed feeding every few hours. And he thought about what happens when the fire goes out at 3 in the morning and the temperature outside is 5 degrees and the person who should be adding wood is asleep, because the body can only fight so long before it surrenders to exhaustion. He did not say any of this to Celia. He was not a man who said things that could be interpreted as worry, because worry implied attachment, and attachment implied that the frozen place inside him was thawing, and he was not ready to admit that yet. Instead, he brought things. A second blanket, wool heavy, that he said he found in his barn, but that still had the fold creases from the store. A canvas tarp for the doorway gap that could be pulled across on the coldest nights to block the wind. An iron poker for the fire, because her wooden stick was burning down to nothing every few days, and an iron poker lasts forever if you do not leave it in the coals. Each Thursday, he arrived and noticed changes. The wall had gained another course of flat stone, the clay from the creek bank sealing the joints, now creating a surface that shed water instead of drinking it. The hearth had been rebuilt with larger river stones carried up from the pool below, and the fireback of stacked limestone was taller now, angled slightly forward so that it threw heat into the room instead of letting it rise straight up the wall. And the back wall was changing. This was the thing that held Josiah's attention the way nothing had held it in 13 years. The back wall of the alcove, the rough limestone face that formed the rear boundary of Celia's room, was getting warmer. Not by accident and not by magic, but by physics, so simple and so elegant that Josiah, a man who had built his own cabin and his own chimney and his own root cellar, had never once thought of it. The fireplace was built directly against the back wall. Every evening, Celia lit the fire and let it burn for 3 or 4 hours before sleeping. The heat from the fire radiated into the limestone. The limestone, hundreds of tons of it running back into the cliff for hundreds of feet, absorbed that heat and conducted it deeper into the mass, which held it the way a lake holds rain. Not temporarily, not the way a cast iron stove holds heat for an hour after the fire dies. Permanently, or as close to permanently as makes no difference. The stone held the heat because stone is patient, and because patience is a form of memory, and because the memory of stone is measured not in hours or days, but in centuries. After 2 weeks of evening fires, the surface temperature of the back wall had risen from 52 degrees to 58. After a month, it held at 60. The wall became a radiator, pushing warmth into the small space all night, all day, regardless of whether the fire was burning. The ceiling, heated by the rising smoke and by conduction from the back wall, became a second radiating surface that pressed warmth downward onto the sleeping platform and the floor. The floor, heated from below by the thermal mass of the cliff and from above by the fire's radiation, was warm enough to sleep on, with nothing but a folded blanket beneath. The smoke rose along the back wall and escaped through a natural fissure where the ceiling met the cliff face, a narrow gap in the limestone that acted as a chimney without being one. The draft was maintained by the waterfall itself, a detail so perfectly accidental that Josiah would have called it providence if he were a praying man, which he had not been since Martha died. The falling curtain of water created a slight negative pressure on the ledge side, the way wind creates low pressure on the lee side of a ridge. And this pressure differential pulled fresh air through the doorway gap and past the fire, maintaining a slow but continuous airflow that kept the room clear of smoke and rich in oxygen without any effort and without any design. She had not engineered this. She had discovered it the way you discover that a certain creek crossing is shallow enough to wade in October by trying and watching and adjusting and paying attention to what the materials want to do rather than forcing them to do what you want. She built the hearth against the back wall because that was where the wall was, and the wall was the sturdiest surface. She noticed the wall getting warm because she slept against it, and her back told her. She noticed the smoke finding the fissure because she watched it rise and followed it with her eyes. And she let the system work, which is a harder thing than building a system, because letting a thing work requires the faith that it will and the patience to wait while it does. Josiah pressed his palm to the back wall on a Thursday in late December. 60 degrees. Outside the temperature was 22. He had unbuttoned his coat without thinking about it, a thing he had not done inside any building other than his own cabin in 13 years, and the unconscious act of unbuttoning the body, responding to warmth before the mind could stop it, was evidence of something that Josiah noted without comment but did not forget. "You're not fighting the rock," he said. "No," Celia said. "You're working with it. It wants to hold heat. I just give it heat to hold." Josiah kept his hand on the wall. He thought about his own cabin, log walls chinked with mud, a stone chimney that drew well but whose heat went up and out into the sky the moment the fire died. Every morning in winter, he woke to a cold house and started over. 60 years of starting over every morning. And here was a woman who had figured out in 3 months, with no tools and no training and no help, that the way to stay warm was not to fight the cold, but to teach the stone to remember the fire. He looked at Celia the way he looked at a ginseng root that had been growing in the same spot for 30 years, with the slow recognition that some things survive not by being strong, but by being patient, and that patience is a kind of strength that most people never learn, because it requires the one thing they cannot tolerate, which is time. That was the Thursday he thought for the first time at a thought he would never speak aloud. She chose fire. I chose ash. The thought sat in him after that. He carried it the way he carried his digging tools, close to the body, always present, not always visible. It was there when he walked back to his cabin. It was there when he sat at the table and looked at Martha's chair. It was there when he took down Caleb's flintlock and held it and put it back without cleaning it, because it was not the anniversary, and because for the first time in 8 years he held the gun and felt not just absence but the weight of his own part in the absence. The weight of the silence he had offered his son on that October morning in 1876. The silence that answered a boy who was asking without knowing. He was asking whether his father still had enough life in him to say goodbye. The week before Christmas, Josiah arrived at the Waterfall, and Celia was not sitting by the fire sewing. She was lying curled on the sleeping platform's face, pale hands clenched around the blanket, and the fire for the first time since he had known her was out. Cold ash in the hearth. The room was not freezing. The back wall still held its stored heat, the thermal mass of the cliff releasing its reserves into the space like a bank releasing savings slowly, reluctantly, but reliably. But the room was cooler than he had ever felt it, and the air had the quality of a space that was losing something it could not get back without help. Celia opened her eyes. They were red, not from crying, from fever. She was sick. Not dangerously, not yet. A cold, a fever. The kind of illness that in a cabin with a warm bed and someone to bring broth and stoke. The fire meant 3 days of rest and recovery. But here behind a waterfall, alone with the fire dead and the night temperature dropping towards single digits, it was not a cold. It was a border. The line between sick and dying is measured in degrees, and the degrees were dropping. Josiah did not speak. He knelt at the hearth and built a fire. His hands knew the work. They had known it for 50 years. Kindling, first shaved thin with a knife he carried on his belt. Then small sticks, dry hemlock, the kind that catches fast and burns hot. Then larger wood oak and hickory from Celia's stack against the south wall. The fire caught. The fire grew. The room began to remember what it was supposed to be. He cooked cornmeal in the tin pot. Thin, almost liquid. The kind of food you give to someone whose body is spending everything it has on fighting and has nothing left for the work of chewing and swallowing solid food. He sat beside Celia on the sleeping platform and fed her with a spoon he had carved from a hickory branch years ago and kept in his coat pocket, because a man who eats alone in the woods every day needs a spoon, and this one had worn smooth from use and fit the hand the way a good tool fits without thinking, without adjusting. He held the spoon to her mouth, and she opened her mouth and ate. And the act of feeding her, the small mechanical motion of dipping and lifting and holding and waiting, shattered something inside him that he did not know was still intact. Because he had done this before. Exactly this. He had sat beside Martha in the last days of the lung sickness and fed her the same way, spoonful by spoonful, watching her swallow, watching the swallowing become harder, watching the intervals between spoonfuls become longer, until the intervals were everything and the spoonfuls were nothing, and Martha closed her eyes and did not open them, and the spoon remained in his hand full with nowhere to go. His hand stopped in midair, the spoon half full of thin cornmeal, hovering between the pot and Celia's mouth. He could not move it. His arm locked, his chest locked. Everything in him that had been frozen for 13 years seized at once, because the body remembers what the mind has buried, and the body does not care about your schedule for grief. It does not care that you have filed it away and labeled it done and moved on. It surfaces when it surfaces, and there is nothing you can do but hold still and wait for it to pass. The way you wait for a cramp to pass, not by fighting it, but by breathing through it and trusting that the body knows more about healing than you do. Celia saw his hand stop. She saw his face, the face of a man whose surface is stone and whose stone has just cracked. She did not ask. She did not speak. She opened her mouth and waited for the next spoonful. And that small act, the opening of the mouth, the waiting, the trust that the spoon would come, was the thing that pulled Josiah through the moment. Because it gave him a task, and a task for a man like Josiah Kane, who had survived 60 years and 13 winters of grief, by doing the next thing that needed doing, was the only thing stronger than pain. Pain stops you. A task starts you. And the simple act of beginning again, of moving the spoon from the pot to the mouth, was enough. He fed her. He stayed. He did not leave that night. For the first time in 13 years, Josiah Kane slept in another person's home. He sat with his back against the warm limestone wall beside the fire, and he kept the fire alive through the night. Every hour he added wood. Every time he added wood, he looked at the fire, and then he looked at Celia, and then he listened to the waterfall. And the three things, the fire and the breathing and the falling water, became a single sound that was the sound of a room that was alive, a room that was holding a life, and Josiah was part of the holding. In the morning, Celia woke. The fever had broken in the night. She was weak, but her eyes were clear. She looked at Josiah sitting beside the fire, his eyes red from a night without sleep, his white beard dusted with ash. "You stayed," she said, "not a question, a fact." "Fire needed tending," Josiah said. "I know," Celia said. "Thank you for tending the fire." They both knew she was not talking about the fire, and they both knew he was not going to acknowledge that she was not talking about the fire. And the knowing shared unspoken was the language they had built between them, the language of the Cumberland Plateau, where care was expressed through action and gratitude was expressed through the acknowledgement of action and love. If that is what this was expressed through the refusal to name it, because naming it would change it, and what it was did not need changing. Spring came to the Cumberland Plateau in March. The dogwoods bloomed white on the slopes. The rhododendron pushed new green leaves through the old, the dark, leathery winter leaves giving way to lighter, softer growth. The waterfall swelled with snowmelt until it roared, and the mist filled the hollow like moe, and the ledge behind the curtain was a world enclosed in sound and moving light. The heavier flow was a challenge. The thicker curtain threw more spray backward, and Celia raised her front wall by another foot, adding courses of flat stone that deflected the mist upward and over the interior. She sealed the new courses with creek bank clay, creating a surface that shed water. She expanded beyond the ledge, a garden on the south-facing terrace above the cliff. Mountain soil thin but rich with leaf mold from centuries of forest, a soil that smelled of earth and time, and the slow, patient work of decay that turns death into life. She planted beans, squash, and potatoes from seeds she bought with the last of her $7 at the store in Pikeville, a 12-mile walk each way, 24 miles round trip, for a handful of seeds that fit in her coat pocket and weighed less than a letter but carried more future than anything she had held since the day she packed her canvas sack and walked south. A chicken pen on the slope beside the waterfall, sheltered from rain by a natural overhang of rock and from predators by a wall of woven rhododendron branches, the stems so dense and interlocking that they formed a barrier as effective as any picket fence. And far more beautiful, the dark green leaves still attached and growing a living wall that strengthened with time instead of weakening. Josiah brought 2 laying hens in April. A gift, he said, though he framed it as a trade for the ginseng roots Celia had found on the slope above the falls and dried on the warm stones of her ledge. The ginseng was worth maybe 30 cents. The hens were worth $1 each. Neither of them mentioned the math. This was the language of the Cumberland Plateau transaction on the surface care. Underneath, never spoken directly because speaking it directly would make it a debt. And debt was a thing between strangers, and they were not strangers. He began teaching her to dig ginseng. This was the most valuable thing he possessed. More valuable than his cabin, more valuable than his tools, more valuable than the small amount of money he kept in a tin box under the floorboards. The knowledge of where the roots grew, how to read the 3-leaf pattern against the dappled forest floor, how to distinguish a 5-year root from a 10-year root by the rings on the neck, how to dig with a wooden paddle instead of a blade to preserve the hair roots where the value lived, how to know when a patch had given enough and needed to be left alone for 3 years to recover the way a field needs to lie. Fallow the way a person needs to lie fallow after giving too much. He taught by doing, not by speaking. He bent and dug and lifted and placed the root in her hand. And Celia learned the way he taught, by watching, by following, by not asking unnecessary questions, because she understood that some knowledge is too important to rush and too fragile to interrupt, and that the best teaching happens in silence, because silence leaves room for the thing being taught to speak for itself. Josiah realized slowly, in the way you realize something with your body, before your mind catches up, the way you realize you are hungry before you think the word hungry, that he was teaching her the thing he had taught Caleb 20 years ago. The same motions, the same patience, the same passing of knowledge from one pair of hands to another across the gap between generations, the gap that is always there, whether the generations are parent and child or something else, something without a name, but with the same weight. He did not call Celia his daughter. She did not call him her father. The Hollows had their own language for relationships that could not be named, and the language was not made of words, but of action. A sack of cornmeal, a cast iron skillet, an afternoon digging ginseng in silence on a hillside above a waterfall, a cup of water offered without being asked. These were the words, and the sentence they formed, if you read it slowly enough and carefully enough and with the patience that the Cumberland Plateau required of everyone who lived on it, said, "You matter. I am here. I will keep showing up." In May, Celia told Josiah about the bear. She told it the way she told everything, calmly, without drama, as if describing the weather on a day that was neither hot nor cold. A black bear, maybe 200 pounds, scratching at the rhododendron wall of the chicken pen in the middle of the night. She went out with her knife and a torch she lit from the hearth and stood 15 feet from the bear, and said in her normal voice, not shouting, not whispering, just speaking, "No." The bear looked at her. She looked back. 30 seconds passed. The bear turned and walked away. Not running, not hurrying, walking the way a bear walks when it has decided that the food is not worth the trouble, the slow, dignified retreat of an animal that does not acknowledge defeat, but merely reconsiders its priorities. Josiah listened and did not comment. But the next Thursday, he arrived carrying a sack of limestone and spent the afternoon helping her build a second wall around the chicken pen. Taller, thicker, with a flat stone gate that could be slid closed at night, heavy enough that no bear would move it without more effort than 2 chickens were worth. While they worked, he said the longest sentence she had heard from him in all the months she had known him. A bear doesn't quit because the wall is high. A bear quits because it gets tired. You build the wall thick enough to tire it out before it gets in. That's the only way. Celia stopped working. She looked at him. "Are you talking about the bear," she said, "or are you talking about something else?" Josiah did not answer. He set the next stone. And the not answering was the answer, because on the Cumberland Plateau, the things a man does not say are the things he means the most. The bear came back 3 times in the month that followed. Each time it tried to get in. Each time it failed. The 4th time it did not come. And somewhere on the hillside above the waterfall, a woman who had once walked south with $7 and no reason to keep walking had 2 chickens and a garden and a wall built by her own hands, and another wall built by 2 pairs of hands working in silence. And the second wall was stronger than the first, because that is what happens when you stop building alone. In Pikeville, Josiah began to notice the way Celia moved through the town. She came early. She spoke little. She left before the morning customers arrived. The storekeeper knew her as the Graves widow who lived somewhere in the hollows and did not ask where, because people on the Cumberland Plateau valued their privacy the way they valued their rifles, absolutely personally and without negotiation. Ruth Phelps noticed Celia. Ruth was 55, widowed, running a dry goods counter beside the general store, with the quiet competence of a woman who had survived a husband who drank and a farm that failed, in a decade of rebuilding, and had come out the other side with a sharp tongue and a soft hand, and the ability to see through any surface to the truth beneath it. Ruth did not ask Celia where she lived. She asked, "Do you need needles? I noticed you're mending with thorns." The question carried no judgment. It carried only observation, which is a form of attention, which is a form of care. Celia looked at Ruth for a long time, the way you look at someone who has asked the right question without knowing they asked it, and said yes. Ruth sold her a needle kit for 10 cents and said, "Next time bring eggs. I'll trade you a tea kettle. Hot tea is good for winter." One afternoon in late spring, Josiah set a bundle of his best ginseng roots on Ruth's counter and said, "For Miss Graves, don't say who." Ruth looked at him with eyes that had seen every kind of man the Cumberland Plateau could produce, the good ones and the broken ones, and the ones who were both, and she said, "I won't say, but she'll know." Josiah left. Ruth was right. Celia knew. And the not saying was their particular dialect of the language they had built, the language where thank you is a cup of water and you're welcome is a sack of cornmeal and love. If that is what this was, is a bundle of ginseng left on a counter with instructions not to say who left it, left by a man who cannot say why he left it for a woman who does not need to ask. June of 1884, a thunderstorm dropped 3 inches of rain on the plateau in 2 hours. The rain came not as rain, but as a wall of water, a vertical river falling from a sky that had turned green and then black and then opened. Every hollow became a creek. Every creek became a river. Every waterfall on every cliff face on the Cumberland Plateau became a torrent, and the waterfall that had no name, the one that was only 15 feet wide and 20 feet tall, became something else entirely. The runoff overwhelmed the normal flow. The curtain of water normally thin enough in June to see through became a solid wall, and behind the wall the water found the ledge and poured over it a surge of brown, muddy water that flooded Celia's room to a depth of 6 inches before it found the gap in the front wall and drained the entire floor of her home, turned into a creek bed for 20 minutes, while the storm raged and the falls roared and the hollow filled with a sound like the world being torn in half. The flood scattered her fire, soaked her sleeping platform, washed her cooking stones off the ledge and into the pool below. 20 minutes. That was all. 20 minutes to undo weeks of work to turn a home back into a ledge, to remind a woman who had begun to feel safe that safety is a thing you build, and the things you build can be destroyed, and the only question that matters after the destroying is whether you build again. Josiah arrived the next day and found her rebuilding, hands scraped raw from pulling stones out of the pool below the falls, face streaked with mud, clothes still damp because she had not stopped working long enough to dry them, but building, the hearthstones already retrieved, the sleeping platform already drying, the fire already burning, fed with wet wood that hissed and popped and threw more smoke than heat, but was fire nonetheless, proof that the decision to stay had been made again, the way all important decisions must be made, not once but over and over every time the world tests them. He stood and watched her work and said nothing, but inside he thought about his own cabin, solid, roofed, raised floor, safe. And he thought, why doesn't she come to my cabin? She could sleep dry and warm and safe, and the walking distance is only 3 miles, and I have a spare room. Caleb's room, and the room has been empty for 8 years, and it could hold a person who needs holding. And then he thought, because my cabin has an empty chair, and she has had enough empty chairs for one lifetime. And he understood. Celia was not here because this was the best place to live. She was here because this was the only place that carried no memory. The waterfall had no past, the limestone had no history. Every other place she could go, every cabin, every hollow, every town, would come with the weight of before, the weight of a life that included Silas, and the weight of before would press on her chest the way the tulip poplar had pressed on Silas's chest, and she would not be able to breathe. Here behind the water, with the sound and the light and the stone that held only the heat she gave it, and nothing else, she could breathe. She could start. Josiah looked down at his own hands. Hands that had dug ginseng for 40 years. Hands that had built a cabin 30 years ago. Hands that had spent 13 years building nothing, repairing everything, maintaining a life that ran on maintenance instead of creation. He bent down. He picked up a flat stone from the rubble at his feet, and he placed it on the wall that Celia was rebuilding. She looked at him. He looked back. Neither spoke. He picked up the next stone. That was the first afternoon in 13 years that Josiah Kane built something new. Not repaired, not maintained, not continued. Built. And he built it in silence beside a 21-year-old woman he had known for 5 months behind a waterfall that had no name on a plateau where he had lived his entire life and never truly seen until a stranger showed him what it looked like when you stopped surviving and started living. The flood left marks. A smear of mud on the rocks below the waterfall visible from the creek. A scatter of hearthstones in the pool that had not been there before. Signs, evidence. The kind of thing that means nothing to a person who is not looking and everything to a person who is. A farmer named Wick Hollis, checking his cattle in the bottomland downstream, noticed the stones in the pool. Stones that were flat and smooth and arranged in a way that water does not arrange stones, because water does not build hearths, and water does not cook food, and water does not carry stones uphill and set them in a circle and blacken them with fire. Wick followed the creek upstream to the waterfall. He saw the mud streak on the rocks. He looked up at the falls. He saw through the thinning summer curtain the shadow of a stone wall where no wall should be. Wick climbed the rocks. Wick stepped through the curtain. Wick found the room. He told his wife Darcy. Darcy told the women at the Pikeville church. The women told the preacher. Josiah heard the news at the Pikeville store on a Thursday morning from the storekeeper, who mentioned it the way you mention weather casually as general information, not knowing that the information was landing on a man for whom it was not general, but specific, and not casual but devastating. The Graves widow living behind a waterfall. Can you imagine? The storekeeper shook his head. Josiah said nothing. He picked up his ginseng payment and walked out. What he felt took him several days to identify. It was not worry. It was not concern, it was anger. And the anger surprised him because he had not felt anger in 13 years, had not felt much of anything in 13 years. And the sudden arrival of it was like blood returning to a limb that has been numb so long you forgot it was attached to you. Not anger at Wick Hollis, who was only curious, whose curiosity was a natural response to an unnatural thing. Anger because the world outside the world of churches and opinions and people who believed they knew what was best for other people was about to arrive at a place that Josiah had come to think of without knowing exactly when the thinking started as part of his life. The waterfall room was not his. It was Celia's. But it was the place where he went every Thursday and sat and drank water and said nothing and felt for 1 hour a week something that was not numbness. Darcy Hollis came before the preacher. She was 35, married to Wick, mother of 3, and she was the kind of woman who confused propriety with goodness and believed that because her own life fit a particular shape, all lives should fit that shape, and any life that did not was not different but wrong. She climbed the rocks. She stepped through the curtain. She stood in the room and looked at the walls and the hearth and the sleeping platform and the garden visible through the thin water and the chickens clucking in their pen. And she said, "Lord have mercy, you can't live like this." Celia looked at her. "I'm living like this," she said. Darcy carried the story back to the Pikeville church not as a wonder but as a tragedy. That poor Graves widow living in a cave like an animal. Someone should do something. Someone should bring her back. Bring her to town. Bring her to a proper house. Bring her to a life that looked the way a life was supposed to look, which meant a life that looked like Darcy's, which meant a life where a woman without a husband lived with relatives and attended church and expressed gratitude for the charity of others and did not under any circumstances build a room behind a waterfall and heat it with the mountain itself and live alone and warm and free. The story reached Preacher Whitfield, and Josiah, hearing it from Celia on a Thursday evening, her voice calm, uninjured, the voice of a woman who had survived a tulip poplar and a 2-day walk into nothing and a winter behind a waterfall, and was not going to be undone by the opinion of a woman who could not fix a door hinge, felt the anger again, and with it something else. Something he recognized only because he had felt its absence for 13 years. The need to protect something that mattered. Preacher Whitfield rode to the waterfall on a Tuesday in July of 1884, and Josiah Kane was already there sitting in a thicket of rhododendron on the slope above the falls, invisible, watching the way he had watched ginseng patches and deer trails and every other valuable thing for 60 years. He did not intend to interfere. He was not a man who stepped between other people and their decisions. But he intended to be present the way a stone wall is present, not doing anything, just there bearing weight, if weight needed bearing. The preacher was young, maybe 30, clean-shaven, riding a bay mare that picked her way down the hollow trail with the nervous precision of a horse that had never been off a road. He wore a black coat and a white shirt, and he carried a Bible in his left hand and his reins in his right, and everything about him, the posture, the jaw, the angle of the Bible said that he had come to do a thing he had already decided was necessary before he arrived and before he saw what he was deciding about. He found Celia on the terrace above the falls, splitting kindling with the short, efficient strokes of a woman who had split enough wood to know that the axe does the work if you let it, and your shoulder does the work if you fight it. The garden was behind her, green and productive. The bean vines climbed their poles. The squash leaves were broad and dark. The potato plants were low and sturdy. The chickens clucked in their double-walled pen. The waterfall filled the hollow with its constant sound, the sound that made casual conversation difficult and sermons impossible, which Josiah, watching from the rhododendron, considered a considerable advantage. Celia set the axe down. She looked at the preacher without the performance of hospitality, without the "how do you do" and the "please sit down" and the "let me get you water" that most people on the Cumberland offered to any stranger who arrived on horseback wearing black. She just looked. "Mrs. Graves," the preacher said, "I'm Preacher Whitfield from the church in Pikeville." "I know who you are," Celia said. "I've come because some of the women in the congregation are concerned about your situation." "My situation," Celia said, and the word came back flatter than it went out, stripped of the preacher's concern, and returned as a fact the way a stone thrown into water comes back as a ripple transformed by the surface it hits. "May I see where you live?" Celia studied him, then she said, "Follow me." She led him down the rocks to the ledge. The preacher climbed poorly, grabbing branches, slipping twice his Bible tucked under his arm in a way that prioritized the book over his own safety. They reached the edge of the curtain. Celia stepped through without hesitation, the water hitting her shoulder, a thing she had done 1,000 times and would do 1,000 more. The preacher hesitated, looked at the falling water, looked at his black coat, and stepped through. The water hit him full across the chest because he did not know to stay to the thin edge, and he came through the curtain, gasping his Bible, wet his shirt soaked, standing in a space that stopped his prepared speech in his throat, the way a wall stops a wind. The room was beautiful. Josiah, who could not see inside from his position above the falls, did not need to see it. He had seen it many times, and it was still beautiful. Every time, the way Martha watching the sunset from the oak tree was beautiful every evening, even though it was the same sunset in the same tree and the same woman. Because beauty is not in the thing being observed, but in the willingness to observe it, and the room behind the waterfall was a place that demanded observation the way a church demands silence by the quality of the space itself. The waterfall cast moving patterns of green and gold light across the stone ceiling, shifting alive. The light of the world filtered through falling water and thrown onto rock in shapes that no artist could paint and no architect could design because they were not designed. They were given the way. All beautiful things are given freely and without conditions, and only to those who put themselves in the place where the giving happens. The back wall radiated warmth. The floor was smooth limestone swept clean. The sleeping platform was neat against the warmest section of wall. The blankets folded the hemlock boughs fresh. The fire was laid ready in the hearth, kindling and small wood arranged with the precision of someone who knew that preparation is the difference between a fire that starts and a fire that doesn't, and therefore between a room that lives and a room that dies. The sound of the water filled the space, constant, enveloping not silence and not noise, but the thing between them. The sound of the world doing what it does without effort. The sound that calms the way a heartbeat calms because it is steady, and because steadiness in a world that is not steady is the closest thing to safety that exists. The preacher stood in the middle of the room. Water dripped from his coat. He turned slowly, looking at everything, and Josiah did not need to see his face to know what was on it, because Josiah had seen his own face the first time he entered this room in January, when the cold outside was killing, and the warmth inside was impossible, and the woman sitting by the fire was sewing a tear in her dress, as though the world were not what it was, but what she had decided to make it. "Mrs. Graves," the preacher said, And Celia told Josiah the words that evening, Thursday, sitting by the fire, sorting dried ginseng into piles by size, her hands working while she spoke. This is not what I expected. What did you expect? Celia asked. I expected misery, the preacher said. And Josiah, hearing this secondhand by firelight, appreciated at least the man's honesty, because honesty in a preacher was rarer than ginseng on a south-facing slope and considerably more valuable. I expected to find a woman in need of rescue. Celia was quiet for a moment. Then she sat on the stone beside the hearth, the stone she used as a chair, the only chair because she had never expected company and had never built for it, and she spoke. She told the preacher about Silas, about the tulip poplar, about the sound of her name spoken at a volume that meant certainty. She told him about selling the land and paying for the pine box, and the preacher who spoke words about a man he did not know. She told him about walking south with $7 and a canvas sack and a grief so heavy it had its own gravity, its own pull bending the light around it so that nothing else was visible. She told him she had not been looking for shelter. She had been looking for a place to stop existing. The waterfall found her first, or she found it. She did not know which and had stopped trying to decide because the deciding did not matter. What mattered was that she was here. When I stood here the first time, she said, and looked out through the water, I felt something I hadn't felt since the day Silas died. Not happiness, not peace, just possibility. The possibility that tomorrow could be different from today. And that was enough. That was everything. The preacher walked to the back wall. He placed his palm against the limestone. The warmth met his skin, and his hand stayed there the way every hand stayed there because the warmth was unexpected. And the unexpected warmth of stone is a thing that demands attention and rewards it. And the reward is the realization that something you assumed was cold and dead is actually warm and alive and has been waiting patiently for someone to notice. Warmer than my parsonage, he said. Celia smiled, small, brief. The kind of smile that is not performed but escapes the way light escapes through a crack in a wall. Not because anyone opened a window, but because the light is there and the crack is there, and the meeting of the two is inevitable. The waterfall rescued me, Preacher Whitfield, she said. I just built the walls. The preacher left. He climbed back up the rocks wetter and quieter than he had come down, and he rode his bay mare up the hollow trail and out of the hollow, and Josiah watched him go from the rhododendron thicket with the satisfaction of a man who has witnessed an education. That Thursday evening, after Celia finished telling the story, Josiah sat for a long time. The fire cracked and popped. The waterfall sang. The light moved on the ceiling the way it always moved, green and gold. The light of the world filtered through water and given on to stone and reflected back into a room where two people sat in the kind of silence that is not empty but full. Then Josiah stood to leave, and at the doorway gap he turned back and spoke. You said you just built the walls, but the walls are the hardest part. Anyone can find a waterfall. Not everyone can build a wall. Celia looked at him. The look went on longer than looks usually go, the way a note held by a good singer goes on longer than you expect. Not because the singer is showing off, but because the note has more in it than you thought, and the singer knows and is giving you time to hear it all. You too, Josiah, she said. You're building too. He walked home in the dark 3 miles through the forest, and the words followed him like footsteps. You're building too. Building what? He had not laid a stone, had not raised a wall, had not done anything except show up every Thursday with a sack of something and sit for an hour and leave. That was not building, that was just being there. But being there, he would learn in the months and years that followed, was how the building starts. Being there is the foundation, everything else is walls. The preacher told his story in Pikeville. Not the story he had gone to find, the story of a woman in need of rescue, but the story he had actually found, the story of a room behind a waterfall that was warmer than his own parsonage, and built by a woman with no tools and no training and no help. The story traveled the hollows of the Cumberland Plateau the way all stories travel through mountain communities, slowly, accurately, and with a respect for the person at its center that flatland gossip rarely provides. On the plateau, a story about a person was not entertainment. It was testimony. And testimony was treated with the same care you treated a seed or a root or a deed to land as something that had value because it contained truth, and truth on the plateau was the most valuable currency there was. The hollows divided as hollows do, because wherever there are people, there are opinions, And wherever there are opinions, there are sides. And wherever there are sides, there are people who believe they are right and people who know they are not wrong, which is not the same thing. Darcy Hollis and the churchwomen stood on one side. They believed Celia should be brought back, brought to Pikeville, placed with a family, given the life that a widow was supposed to have, which was the life of a woman defined by what she had lost rather than by what she had built. Ruth Phelps stood on the other side. She stood there the way she stood, everywhere firmly, with her feet planted and her voice clear, and her eyes seeing through every pretense the way water sees through a sieve. She had buried a husband who drank himself to death at 42 and rebuilt a life from what he left behind, which was nothing but debt and a reputation and a farm that grew more rocks than corn. She knew what it meant to start over. She knew what it cost. And she knew that the women who stood on Darcy's side of the argument, the women who said Celia should be brought back and placed and settled and managed, had never started over from nothing, because they had never been allowed to lose everything, and that their certainty about how a widow should live was the certainty of people who have never tested their own certainty against the reality of sleeping on stone and eating what you grow and keeping yourself alive through a winter that is trying to kill you with nothing but fire and patience and the refusal to quit. Ruth said loud enough for everyone in the store who cared to listen and several who pretended not to. I know women in this town who live in houses their husbands built and won't fix a door hinge on their own. Miss Graves built an entire wall. Who needs rescuing here? Josiah did not join the debate. He was not a man who spoke in stores. But the next time someone asked him about the girl behind the falls, he said 3 sentences. She's warm. She eats enough. She didn't ask anybody's opinion. And on the Cumberland Plateau, those 3 sentences were the most complete description of a sovereign human being that anyone had ever needed to hear. The argument faded. Not because anyone won, but because everyone had corn to hoe and wood to chop and cattle to feed and lives to maintain, and the maintenance of your own life is always eventually more urgent than the management of someone else's. The argument did not end. It dissolved the way ice dissolves in a creek in March, not all at once, but gradually, the edges softening, the mass shrinking until one day it was gone, and no one could remember exactly when it left. The years that followed are not a story made of events. They are a story made of time, which is a different material. Events are stone. Time is water. Events are what you build with. Time is what builds you. And the 13 years that Celia Graves lived behind the waterfall and the 13 years that Josiah Kane walked to and from the waterfall are best told not as a sequence of things that happened, but as a collection of moments that remain the way certain stones remain in a creek bed after the current has carried everything else downstream. The stones that remain are the ones that are heaviest, and weight in a story is measured not in pounds, but in truth. In the second year, Josiah brought a goat. Celia expanded the room, extending the front wall and adding a second chamber on the north end of the alcove where the ceiling was lower, but the space was usable for storage and for the goat on the coldest nights. Josiah helped build it. They worked side by side, handing stones without asking, fitting them without discussing, and the silence of 2 people working together who know what the work needs is a silence that Josiah recognized. He and Martha had built their cabin in that same silence 30 years ago. The silence where you do not need to say, "Hand me that stone," because the other person has already picked it up, and you do not need to say it fits here because the other person can see the gap. It is the silence of shared purpose, which is the deepest intimacy that 2 people who work with their hands can share, deeper than conversation, deeper than confession, because it requires no words and therefore no risk, and therefore no defense, and therefore no distance. She never sealed the front completely. The waterfall was her wall, her door, her protection, and her companion, and she would no more have blocked it than she would have stopped breathing. She lived with it. She lived behind it. She lived because of it. In the 3rd year, Josiah replaced the dirt floor of his own cabin with wood planking. He did this without telling anyone and without being asked. He also built new shelves. He also, on a Thursday evening after returning from the waterfall, opened the closet where Martha's clothes had hung for 12 years and took them out one garment at a time and folded each one carefully the way Martha had folded them, with the sleeves tucked in and the fabric smooth, and placed them in the oak chest at the foot of the bed. He did not throw them away. He put them away. And the difference between throwing away and putting away is the difference between denial and acceptance. Throwing away says the past did not happen. Putting away says the past happened and it mattered. And the clothes are beautiful and they will be kept and they will be honored, but they will not be worn again. And the closet will hold other things now because the closet is part of a house. That is part of a life that is continuing, not in the old way, the dead mechanical way, but in the new way, the way that involves building and teaching and walking 3 miles to a waterfall every Thursday and sitting in a room that is warm because a woman taught the mountain to hold fire. He did not tell Celia, but the next time she came to his cabin, which she had begun to do occasionally bringing eggs and honey, she looked at the new wood floor and said one word, "Nice." Josiah nodded, one word, one nod, enough. On the Cumberland Plateau, enough is the highest form of eloquence. In the fourth year, something changed in Josiah's cabin that had nothing to do with wood floors or new shelves. It had to do with the flintlock, Caleb's flintlock. The gun that had hung on the wall for 8 years, taken down and cleaned once a year on the anniversary of the day the boy left. In the fourth year on the anniversary, Josiah took the gun down. He cleaned it. He oiled the barrel. He wiped the stock. He checked the flint. And then instead of hanging it back on the wall, he wrapped it in oilcloth and placed it in the oak chest beside Martha's folded clothes. Not thrown away, put away. The wall where it had hung had a rectangle of darker wood where the gun had blocked the light, a shadow of absence, a shape that said something used to be here. Josiah looked at the shadow on the wall for a long time. Then he hung a small shelf in its place and put a jar of Celia's hemlock honey on it. The honey glowed amber in the afternoon light that came through the cabin window, and the light through the honey threw a warm gold shape on the wall that was not the same size or the same shape as the shadow of the gun, but that occupied the same space, and the replacement was not erasure but transformation, which is what happens when you stop preserving loss and start making room for what comes after. In the fourth and fifth years, Celia became known in Pikeville, not as the poor Graves widow, but as the woman behind the falls. Her ginseng was the best on the plateau because Josiah had taught her, and because she had inherited his patience without either of them knowing the inheritance had occurred. Her honey had a distinctive hemlock blossom flavor because she had coaxed a wild swarm into a rock crevice near the falls. The bees drawn to the moisture and the shelter and the flowers that grew in the mist zone and around the waterfall, flowers that grew nowhere else in the hollow, because nowhere else had the particular combination of water and light and stone that the falls provided. Ruth Phelps sold Celia's goods from her counter and kept the money for her in a tin box labeled Graves in Ruth's steady handwriting. Ruth and Celia developed their own language over those years, a language different from the one between Josiah and Celia, but built from the same materials from action and observation and the particular economy of speech that women on the Cumberland Plateau practiced the way they practiced canning and quilting, as a skill passed from hand to hand and refined with use. Ruth never asked Celia if she was happy. Ruth asked if the garden was producing. Ruth never asked if she was lonely. Ruth asked if the chickens were laying. And the answers to the practical questions contained, folded inside them like quilting stitches, hidden inside the batting. The answers to the other questions, the ones that neither woman would have asked or answered directly, because directness on the plateau was for strangers, and they were not strangers. Celia no longer came to Pikeville in the dark before the customers arrived. She came in daylight. She came when she chose. She traded and talked briefly and left. She was not hiding anymore. She was choosing. And the difference between hiding and choosing is the difference between fear and freedom, which is the difference between running from something and walking toward it, which is the difference between the woman who walked south in October of 1883 and the woman who walked to Pikeville in the spring of 1887. The same woman, the same body, the same dark blue eyes, but a different person inside the body. A person who had been built the way the room had been built, stone by stone, or by fire day by day until the structure held and the warmth stayed, and the future which had once been a thing she could not imagine became a thing she could see. In the spring of 1888, when Josiah was 64, the storekeeper in Pikeville handed him an envelope, postmarked Portland, Oregon. The handwriting leaned to the right at the same slant as Martha's because Caleb had learned his letters from his mother, and the mother's hand lived on in the son's hand, the way all handed down things live on in the angle and the pressure and the particular way the pen meets the paper. Josiah put the envelope in his coat pocket. He walked home. 3 miles. He sat at the table. He placed the letter in front of him and looked at it for 2 hours without opening it. He was afraid, not of bad news, afraid of feeling, afraid that opening the letter meant admitting that 12 years of silence had been a choice, his choice, and that the choice had been wrong. Afraid that opening it meant admitting that when Caleb stood in the doorway and said, "I'm going west," and waited for his father to speak, the silence that answered was not strength and was not stoicism, and was not the Cumberland Plateau way of letting a man make his own decisions. It was cowardice. It was a father too frozen by grief to say the word that needed saying. Whichever word it was, stay or go or I love you or come back when you're ready, any word at all, because any word was better than the silence. And the silence was what Caleb carried west with him, the silence of a father who could not say goodbye, and the weight of that silence was the weight of every mile between Tennessee and Oregon, and every year between 1876 and 1888. He opened it. The letter was short. Caleb was in Portland. He was a carpenter. He had a wife. He had a 2-year-old son, and he had named the boy Josiah. The letter said, "I named him after you, Pa. I don't know if you want to know, but I wanted you to." Josiah read the letter 3 times. 3 times through 3 sentences that contained 12 years of absence, and the end of absence, and the beginning of something that he did not have a name for because he had never felt it before this particular thing. This combination of grief and gratitude and shame and joy, and the overwhelming awareness that time, which he had treated as an enemy for 13 years, was actually an ally. Because time had brought this letter to this table on this afternoon, and the letter said that somewhere in Oregon, a boy was named Josiah, and the boy existed and the name existed, and therefore the connection existed, and the connection had survived 12 years of silence. Because connections like stone do not die. They just wait. He put the letter down. He stood up. He walked to the waterfall. 3 miles, near dark. He climbed the rocks and stepped through the curtain and sat in Celia's room beside the fire. And for the first time in all the months and years that Celia had known him, Josiah Kane cried. Not loudly, not the way a dam breaks, the way water seeps through a rock wall, slow, steady, from the deepest place. Tears running down his face while his expression barely changed the face of a man of 64 who has held everything inside for so long that even the releasing is controlled, even the breaking is structural, the cracks opening along the grain of the stone rather than shattering it because the stone is too strong to shatter and too old to pretend that it has no cracks. Celia did not ask. She placed a cup of water beside him, the same gesture he had made for her in January. The gesture that said, "I see you and I am here, and that is all I will do because that is all you need." She continued sorting beans. The small, dry sound of beans falling into the tin cup filled the room, the way the waterfall filled it, with a rhythm that said, "The world is still here, the work is still here, you are not alone, and the proof of your not being alone is not words, but the sound of someone doing ordinary things beside you, while you come apart and put yourself back together." Josiah sat for an hour, then he wiped his face with his sleeve. He drank the water. He said, "I have a grandson. His name is Josiah." Then he stood and left. He wrote by short, 4 sentences. "I know now, I wanted to know. Your boy named Josiah is the best thing I've heard in a long time. I'm sorry I didn't say so sooner." He mailed it in Pikeville on Thursday after sitting in the waterfall room for his usual hour. He did not tell Celia about the letter he wrote, but the next Thursday he came to the waterfall carrying a small piece of cherry wood, the best wood on the Cumberland. Tight-grained, warm-colored, the kind of wood you use for things that matter, because the wood itself is a statement of value. He sat beside the fire and began to carve. His hands, which had not carved anything since the early years of his marriage, when he made Martha a set of spoons and a butter mold, remembered the motions the way hands always remember, with a knowledge that lives in the tendons and not in the brain. "What are you making?" Celia asked. "A little horse and cart." "For who?" "For my grandson." Celia smiled. And Josiah, holding the knife, looking at the cherry wood, smiled too. 2 smiles in a room behind a waterfall. Small, real. The kind of smiles that are not performed for anyone but happen because the person smiling has forgotten for a moment to prevent it. Caleb wrote again. Not often, 2 or 3 letters a year. Josiah answered every one. Each letter was a little longer than the one before, the sentences stretching out the way a road stretches out when you have been walking it long enough to trust that it goes somewhere. Neither of them wrote the word sorry. Neither wrote forgive. Those words belonged to a kind of conversation they would never have, not because they could not, but because they did not need to. They said what needed saying by continuing to write, by showing up on the page the way Josiah showed up at the Waterfall every Thursday. And on the Cumberland Plateau, showing up was enough. Showing up was everything. The years continued. Josiah grew older in the way that men on the Cumberland Plateau grew older, not suddenly but steadily, the way a hillside erodes a little at a time, the changes invisible from day to day, but unmistakable from year to year. His steps slowed on the trail. He rested more often on the climb to the falls. The rocks that he had once climbed without thinking now required attention and care, and the particular concentration of a man who knows that the distance between climbing and falling is one wet stone and one moment of inattention. There were mornings now when he woke and his hands did not close all the way, the joints swollen from decades of digging in cold earth, and he had to work them open like stiff hinges, flexing and extending the fingers, curling slowly into fists, and then uncurling the pain. A dull thing that lived in the knuckles and did not leave, but became over time a kind of companion. The way all persistent things become companions if you live with them long enough. He still dug ginseng, but he dug less. He still walked the hollows, but he walked slower. The forest did not change. He changed. And the gap between what his body could do and what his memory said it should be able to do widened every year. And the widening was not painful because he had learned from Celia and from the waterfall and from the stone that held heat without complaint that diminishing is not the same as ending. A fire burns lower in the morning than it burns at midnight, but it is still fire. A creek runs thinner in August than in March, but it is still water. And a man of 68 or 69 or 70 is still a man, still capable of walking to a waterfall, still capable of sitting beside a fire, still capable of holding a piece of cherry wood and a knife and making something beautiful with hands that hurt. At 66, he said to Celia on a Thursday afternoon sitting by the fire, "Next winter I won't make the climb. Then I'll come down," Celia said without hesitation, without pause, the way you answer a question that you have already answered in your mind long before it was asked. And from that Thursday forward, Celia walked 3 miles to Josiah's cabin every week. She brought eggs, honey, dried ginseng. She stayed 1 hour, not more, because she understood that Josiah was a man who valued solitude not as loneliness, but as a habitat the way a certain plant values shade, and that her presence was welcome, but her absence was also welcome. And the rhythm between the two was what he needed. She cooked for him, checked the roof for leaks, split a week's worth of wood, and stacked it by the door. The roles reversed. The giver became the receiver. And Josiah, who had given his whole life, who had defined himself by providing and protecting and carrying the weight, had to learn the hardest thing he had ever learned, harder than ginseng, harder than grief, harder than 13 years of frozen silence. He had to learn to sit in a chair while someone else worked for him. He had to learn that accepting help was not weakness, but trust, and that trust was the thing he had not offered anyone since Martha died and Caleb left, and the world became a place where you carried your own weight because there was no one else to carry it, and carrying your own weight was the same as being strong. It was not the same as being strong. It was the same as being alone. And he was learning at 66 and 67 and 68 that being alone and being strong were different things, and that the difference was the distance between surviving and living, and that the distance could be closed even at his age, even after all this time, even after the ice and the silence and the years of ash. Celia at 30 and 31 and 32 was not the woman who had walked south with $7 and a desire to stop existing. She was lean and strong and rooted the way a hemlock tree is rooted, not in the shallow soil of the topsoil, but in the deep cracks of the bedrock, drawing sustenance from stone itself. She was not a hermit. Ruth Phelps visited, sometimes climbing the rocks with the careful deliberation of a woman who did not intend to break a hip for the sake of a social call, but who made the social call anyway because some people are worth the climb. Other people from the hollows, 1 or 2, knew the path to the falls and came occasionally, not often, but enough that Celia remained part of the world even as she lived at its edge. Her solitude was no longer flight, it was architecture. She had designed it the way she designed her room, with walls in the right places and openings in the right places and warmth stored in the stone for the nights when warmth was needed. The small cherrywood horse and cart wrapped in cloth and packed in a box with wood shavings from Josiah's cabin floor traveled by post from Pikeville to Portland, Oregon. The postmaster in Pikeville weighed the box and charged 12 cents for postage and asked Josiah who it was for. Josiah said, "My grandson." The postmaster looked at him because everyone in Pikeville knew that Josiah Kane lived alone and had lived alone for as long as anyone could remember and had no family that anyone had ever seen. But the postmaster did not ask further because on the Cumberland Plateau, you did not question a man's statement about his own family. And if Josiah Kane said he had a grandson, then he had a grandson, and the 12 cents was paid and the box was sent, and that was the end of the transaction and the beginning of something else. Josiah never saw the boy. He never traveled to Oregon. The distance was too far, the cost too high, the leaving too difficult for a man whose roots were sunk as deep into the Cumberland Plateau as any ginseng root he had ever dug. But the boy had the horse and cart, and the boy had the name. And across 2,000 miles of America, the connection held thin as a thread, strong as a root alive, because both ends kept feeding it. The old man with his letters and the young man with his back and forth across the years, like the shuttle on a loom weaving something that neither of them could see, but both of them could feel a fabric made of words on paper, and the silence between the words and the understanding that the silence was not empty but full. The same understanding that Josiah had learned in a room behind a waterfall from a woman who knew more about silence than anyone he had ever met. On an afternoon in autumn, perhaps in 1896, perhaps in some other year. That does not matter because the moment exists outside of time the way all true moments do. Josiah Kane sat on the porch of his cabin on the Cumberland Plateau. He was 73 years old. His hands rested on his knees, the hands that had dug the earth for more than half a century, that had built a cabin and buried a wife and cleaned a flintlock once a year and fed a woman through a fever and picked up a stone and placed it on a wall and carved a horse from cherry wood for a boy he had never met. The sun was low. October, the angle that turns ordinary wood into gold and ordinary air into crystal, and ordinary moments into the kind of moments that you remember. Not because anything happened, but because everything was present, the light and the air and the temperature and the particular quality of stillness that October brings to the Cumberland Plateau when the leaves have turned and the wind has not yet come to take them. He looked south toward the hollow where the waterfall was. He could not see it. He could not hear it. But he knew it was there the way he knew the ginseng patches and the deer trails in the particular spot on the hillside behind the cabin where Martha lay under the oak tree with the M carved in the bark and the J carved beside it, because he had carved it there years ago without telling anyone, not the J for Josiah, but the J for joining, for the idea that two letters side by side on the bark of a tree means something, even when the people they represent are no longer side by side, even when one of them is under the ground and the other is sitting on a porch in the autumn light remembering. He remembered the January afternoon he found smoke coming from inside the stone. He remembered the cold of the water on his shoulder as he stepped through the curtain and the warmth of the room that met him on the other side, the impossible warmth, the warmth that should not have been there, and was like finding a fire burning in an empty house, like finding a heartbeat in a body you thought was still. He remembered pressing his palm to the warm limestone and feeling the heat that a 21-year-old widow had given to the mountain, and the mountain had given back the heat of a fire lit by someone who had every reason to let the fire go out and chose instead to feed it. He remembered the words, "I'm warming the mountain. It's warming me back." He remembered the way she said them without pride, without wonder, as a fact the way you state any fact that is so true, it does not require emphasis. He remembered the night he stayed, the night the fire was out and Celia was sick, and he knelt at the hearth and built a fire with hands that had built 1,000 fires, but had not built one for another person in 13 years. He remembered the spoon, the cornmeal. The moment his hand stopped in the air and the world contracted to a point of pain that contained Martha and the taste of loss and the particular cruelty of repetition, of finding yourself doing the same thing in a different room for a different person, and the body refusing to separate the two. The body insisting that feeding is feeding and loss is loss, and that every spoonful of thin cornmeal held to a sick woman's mouth is also the last spoonful held to a dying woman's mouth. And there is nothing you can do about the conflation except breathe through it and wait for it to pass, and trust that the mouth opening in front of you is not the mouth that closed forever, but a new mouth, a living mouth, a mouth that is waiting for you to continue. He remembered the afternoon after the flood when he picked up the first stone. He remembered the weight of it in his hand, the heft of flat limestone, 20 pounds of the earth's own material, and the act of placing it on the wall beside her, the first thing he had built in 13 years, and how the placing of the stone was not a small act, but a declaration, a statement made in the only language he trusted, the language of things done with the hands, the language that cannot lie, because the hands do not know how. He remembered the letter from Caleb, the 2 hours of staring, the fear that was not fear of bad news, but fear of feeling, which is the worst fear there is because it is fear of yourself, of what lives inside you that you have not looked at. And the opening of the letter was the opening of a door to a room you have kept locked, and the room contains everything you have put there, or every unfelt feeling, every unsaid word, every silence that was not strength, but cowardice. And the room is full, and the door is open, and there is nothing to do but walk in. He remembered the cherry wood horse and cart, the feel of the knife in his hands, after years of not carving, the grain of the wood opening under the blade, the way a story opens under the telling, revealing what was always there, waiting to be shaped, waiting for the hand that would shape it. He remembered something Celia had told him once on a winter evening, sitting by the fire sorting ginseng. Her voice quiet, the voice of a person offering a thing they have carried a long time. Something her mother said before she died. Stone doesn't die, Celia. Stone just waits. He had been stone for 13 years, waiting without knowing he was waiting, frozen without knowing he was frozen, because the frozen place had become so normal that it felt like temperature, like the way things were supposed to be, like the way things had always been and would always be. And then a woman lit a fire in a room behind a waterfall, and the heat from that fire traveled through the rock slowly, patiently, the way heat travels through limestone, not breaking anything, not forcing anything, just moving through the grain of the stone, the way water moves through the grain of the earth until the stone remembered what it was like to be warm. And the stone gave back what it had been given, the way the mountain gave Celia back her heat. Night after night, year after year, the oldest bargain in the world. Josiah placed his hand on the arm of the chair beside him. Martha's chair, the oak rocking chair he had made with his own hands 30 years ago. The chair that had been empty for 25 years. The chair he had looked at every evening across the table and seen only absence, the specific absence of a specific person, the absence that has a shape and a weight and a temperature which is always cold, which is always the temperature of something that should be warm and is not. He placed his hand on the oak, and the wood was warm, not body warm, not fire warm, sun warm. The autumn sun on oak, the simplest warmth there is. The warmth that happens when light falls on a thing and the thing holds it, and the holding is not effort but nature, the way wood holds sun and stone holds fire, and a person holds another person's memory, not by trying but by being made of the kind of material that holds. He did not see the empty chair anymore. He saw the chair. Just the chair. Oak, solid, made by his own hands in a time when he built things because he believed in the future. Martha was not in the chair. Martha would never be in the chair again. That was the truth, and the truth had not changed and would not change. But his relationship to the truth had changed. The truth was the same. He was different. He could look at the chair now and see what it was instead of what it was not. He could see the wood instead of the absence, the craft instead of the loss, the warmth instead of the cold. And somewhere south, 3 miles through the forest behind a waterfall that had no name, because it did not need one, a woman of 34 was placing her hand against a limestone wall. 60 degrees, steady, unchanged, the same temperature it had been yesterday and would be tomorrow and the day after that. The heat she had given the stone, and the stone had held, and the stone had given back night after night, year after year, the slow, patient exchange that requires nothing but consistency and rewards, nothing but faith. That bargain held. It held across seasons and across years and across the distance between a porch in the autumn light and a room behind falling water. It held because both ends kept their part. The woman gave heat to the stone. The stone gave heat to the woman. The old man gave presents to the Thursday visits. The Thursday visits gave presents back to the old man. And neither of them asked for more than was given, because what was given was enough. Josiah Kane, 73 years old, closed his eyes on the porch of his cabin. The October sun lay warm on his face. The Cumberland Plateau stretched around him in every direction, the hollows and ridgelines and creeks and unnamed waterfalls, and the deep patient stone beneath all of it, holding what it had been given, giving back what it held. Inside the cabin in the oak chest at the foot of the bed, Martha's clothes lay folded beside an oilcloth-wrapped flintlock and a bundle of letters from Portland, Oregon, tied with string. On the shelf where the gun once hung, a jar of hemlock honey caught the light. On the table, a letter half-written, the pen resting on the paper, the ink not yet dry, the last sentence reading, "The leaves are turning and the honey is good this year, and I am well." 3 miles south, behind a waterfall that had no name and needed none, a fire burned in a limestone hearth. The smoke rose along the back wall and found the fissure and escaped into the October air. The back wall held its heat 60 degrees, the same as yesterday, the same as tomorrow, the temperature of patience, the temperature of stone that has learned what it was given and does not forget. A woman of 34 sat beside the hearth, her hands sorting ginseng roots or roots by size, the dry whisper of the roots against the stone floor, mixing with the sound of falling water. The two sounds together making a music that no instrument could play, because it was not composed but given the music of a life built from nothing by someone who started with less than nothing and built anyway. She placed her hand against the wall. The stone was warm under her palm. It had been warm yesterday and would be warm tomorrow. She had given it heat, and it had given the heat back, and this exchange, this conversation between fire and stone, between the one who gives and the one who holds, had continued for 13 years and would continue for as long as she chose to continue it, which was as long as the water fell and the stone held and the fire burned, which was forever or close enough to forever that the difference did not matter. The oldest bargain in the world, between a person and the thing that shelters them, between fire and stone, between the one who gives warmth and the one who holds it, between a woman and a mountain and the water that falls between them, like a curtain, not hiding one from the other, but joining them the way a curtain joins the stage to the audience, the way a doorway joins inside to outside, the way a word spoken across a clearing at the volume of certainty joins one person to another, for as long as the sound lasts and longer, because some sounds do not stop when the air stops carrying them. Some sounds live in the stone that heard them. Waiting, the way stone waits, the way all things that endure have always waited, not for something to happen, but for someone to notice that they are already warm. And he was warm.